Evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to Tone Fert webinar. You all probably know me. Some of you mightn't know me to see me, but Leslie Dwyer here. I'm very pleased to have Tim Hinman from Metal Farm in New Zealand with us. Tim is obviously one of the main drivers behind the Tone Fert in overall. And we're very privileged to have back for the second year in a row Mr. Canaan Ahu from Agronomics in New Zealand also. So first of all, I suppose a bit of housekeeping. We have if everybody could mute your mics just in case we get any background noise. But if you have any questions as Canaan's going through the presentation, there is a question and answers tab up top. It's third in from the left. So please feel free to type in any questions, and Canaan's able to see that and pick up on those questions as we go along. I suppose the reason we wanted to talk this year about soil structure, well, I suppose for most of you is pretty evident. The last couple of years with the rainfall we've had and the conditions we've had, really up until recently, has been detrimental to soil health and soil structure. We've seen a lot of issues with soil structure and compaction this year, and it was really exacerbated by the prolonged weather we had last autumn, last winter, this spring, and then early turnout. And really farmers having to get out to grass and get stock out, even though conditions were way less than ideal. So in the conversation I had with Canaan a couple of months ago, it's funny, some of the stuff, we are doing some trial work at the moment, trialing out different products, different product types, different product applications to see if we can improve soil structure and water infiltration rates. And in the conversation with Canaan, he was telling me that they've been doing putting some of those practices on place on farms in New Zealand and getting quite good results. So I asked him if he'd be kind enough to come on, do a presentation and give us the background, I suppose, to what's affecting soil structure and maybe ways that we can look at on our own farms with the Tone Fert as to how we can, over time, improve structure and improve production without driving up cost and using more nitrogen. So I'll hand over to Canaan, and thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I feel very privileged to come back. Time of it with Tim and Leslie, just opening the floor to have the discussions. I sort of run a company called Agronomics back here and in New Zealand. We're a team of 10 and we cover sort of sheep and beef, dairy, viticulture, and sort of a bit of a spectrum. But we're quite passionate, I think, at doing the best that we can to build nutrition and to facilitate health onwards and upwards towards the crop, and it kind of all starts at the soil. So very privileged to be back. Thank you. I'm going to push into presentation. The idea is to kind of wrap it up within an hour. We're going to have some questions along the way, and I'll just try and dive in and out a little bit. I really kind of want to try to create a discussion, and there might be a time and space where we kind of have a breather at different points and I'll say, cool, any questions on that topic? Because that's kind of the way that I think it will sink in, or we can kind of ask our relative questions to that context piece. So awesome. Bear with me. I am just about to share. Primo. Okay, cool. Is this pulled up, guys?
Yes.
It's pulled up the presenting side there, Canaan, rather than actual full
Okay,
screen.
cool. We'll try this. Bear with. Okay, here we go. How about now?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Perfect.
So you can just see a full screen?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep.
Brilliant. Awesome. So we've coined this profit from structure purely because structure from a soil perspective has a massive weight and bearing on the flow-on impact for us as farming, and your poor Irish have really felt a large chunk of that as the disease kind of captured. So the content of today, we're going to talk about plant and soil relationship, their connection together, what happens when they function well and what happens when maybe they don't. The foundation is really talking about the structural pieces of soil that matter. Then we're going to quietly touch on compaction, move into biology, and mineral as our probably two strong arms. And then we're going to touch on a couple of cases where we've used things like liquid calcium. And to finish, we're going to touch on a topic which is just around coated N. Leslie brought up to our attention recently that the Irish government is looking to kind of box people into having to use it. I guess pros and cons, and what data do we have around that? Cool bananas. So this is what we call the plant diagram, and we use this to illustrate in kind of a picture format to take theory and then belt it out into some shape or form that we can actually see it. So this is a plant, and the plant exists to photosynthesize, and this is the process. It's taking CO2, water from the soil, and sunlight to produce sugar. In theory, the higher that we have a photosynthetic rate, or the more sunshine that we can capture, as a farmer, whether I'm growing grass on my animal, putting sugar into a crop, or trying to grow a crop of barley, it doesn't really matter the context. We all have to function through this mechanism. So some of that's going to be used for upstairs function, and roughly speaking, call it 50 to 75%. So we've got leaf development, building more cell structures, capturing more sunlight. And then we also have a decent chunk of it that's going to go downstairs. So roughly 25 to 50% at any one point in time will head downstairs. And the reason for that is because we want to grow more roots. That carbon has to be traded with biology in order to go and get stuff. And then we also want to store carbon. So if we don't have much green material above that soil surface, essentially our ability to send sugar downstairs is going to be extremely limited. So we're going to park that side of the diagram. We're going to come over here to the left side where soil has a charge, and it's due to what we call the clay particle, and it's basically always negatively charged. What that means is that things that have a positive charge, aka minerals, will essentially bind to that negative charge site. So things like calcium and magnesium have a 2+ ion charge, which means that they're going to hold on to 2 negative sites. Things like potassium, sodium, and ammonium, they all have a single charge, or a monovalent charge, which means that they're going to hang on to just 1. But we also have things in the soil that are negatively charged. So things like nitrate, sulfate, phosphate, boron, lipdate, they're all anions. And what that means is they don't have the same ability to stick to that soil. So the two major pools, we've got cations, anything with a positive charge, and anions, things with a negative charge. Now what's really important here is that we've always got 2 forces that are acting. The first one is gravity, and the second is water. And you can't stop that. It's just the laws of Mother Nature. So what that means is those anions at this point in time don't have a lot to stick to. And that's why we're always vulnerable to things like nitrate leaching and sulfate disappearing through our wetter months. So what's really, really important is that we build what we call organic matter, or carbon. Now, organic matter / carbon, we use them interchangeably. They're the same thing in short, but in essence, they contain both positive and negative charge. And so because they have both charges, they can hold both mineral sets. So whether you're dealing with a cation or an anion, they're going to basically attract and hold, which is awesome. It also stores moisture, and organic matter is kind of the pantry, if it were, and the house, all in the same for our microbes. And so having good organic matter is going to really help set us up to succeed. So we're going to move to that root structure now, and we're going to probably split into 2 major microbe groups. The first one being bacteria, and the second one being a fungi. Now, the plant is always communicating to these guys. He will change the nature of what that sugar is, depending on what he needs from that soil and from that soil solution. He will change in code. And what do I mean by that? So let's pretend that the plant is short of phosphate today, and he knows he's short of phosphate. What he'll do is he will code that sugar. So from up the top, when that CHO, that sugar gets sent down to that root structure, it's been coded, and it means it's got a certain set of instructions, and it's a microbe food to a certain group. And so in this particular case, we'll call it bacteria. We'll go and get that phosphate and return for more sugar. And this is quite special because whatever that plant needs, in theory, it basically will communicate forth. And granted we have it on that soil site, we're going to be okay. If we didn't have that microbe, it doesn't function, it doesn't flow, it retards. And even if you had a tank that had everything in the world that you wanted, if that microbe isn't there, or it doesn't have air, or that link is missing, we basically miss out. So what does this mean when we get to something like compaction? Well, the hard part is we might have just gone from an 8-cylinder motor to a 4-cylinder motor. What do I mean by that? Well, if we only have access to 50% of that soil root zone, then essentially moisture, microbial activity, biomass breakdown, minerals, root growth, and plant growth are all going to be massively impacted. And this is quite serious. If we had a Lamborghini and we couldn't afford to put fuel in it, it would just sit in the shed, and essentially our soils can turn like this if we're not careful. So if we don't have roots past that compaction layer, or wherever that air layer stops, we basically have no root. If we don't have a root, then the plant can't send sugar there. And if we don't have a root and we can't send sugar there, we're not likely to have the right microbe present to actually help us. So that all makes sense. We've got this relationship between the plant, that root structure, and then it's got to transition whatever minerals on that soil site across back through to that root microbes and then back up to the plant. Now, I guess if we break this all down, really, soil, it's a beast of a thing. However, it's actually quite simple. We roughly want 25% water. We roughly want 25% air. Now, those are quite massive pieces. This mineral constituent here makes up about 45%, and then the organic was kind of short for organic matter. It just means that we have to have carbon present. And so essentially we need those fundamentals together. If we are short, or we have, for example, like Ireland's had, too much water, then that takes up my airspace, and then that's going to have a massive function on my or bearing on my root structure. So we've got to get the foundation together. Air is essentially everything. If air is short and we don't have enough of it, then our ability for our microbes to function suffers. Secondary to that, we need organic matter. That's the microbe bridge. It's also the pantry, so how much food we have in the tank for the microbes. And in conjunction with all of that, it's its home. And then we talk about carbon and nitrogen ratio. They've got to go well together, because you can have what we call like a peaty type soil that has a lot of organic matter, but it may not have life unless you add air to it. And then really we just need a spectrum of microbes and a spectrum of minerals. You have all of those components, then you're well on your way to setting up soil to function, to flourish, and for us to get the best out of it. So in short, there's kind of this three-legged stool, and you've probably heard this in many different cases, but we need biology, we need physics, and we need chemistry. And those three then create the environment, or AKA our soil, our house. So in the topic of compaction, we've got major 3 lanes, and we're going to break into them today. So we've got biology, physics, and mineral. And what do I mean by that when we say compaction? That 3-legged stool is our ability with lanes on how we're going to tackle something. So let's hypothesize here. Let's pretend we're in the middle lane with physics. If I go and cultivate a paddock because it's just tough as nails and doesn't have air, cool, it might open up. We might create a habitat that has air, but if I don't create the right mineral to come in alongside that, and I don't promote the right biology to come in alongside that, in most scenarios that I've seen play out, we will revert and call it 1 to 2 years, maybe a little bit longer if we're lucky. Likewise, if I play out in just the biology camp, call it feed fungi, try and create a habitat, put the food sources in there and promote fungi to develop and grow to create that macropore structure, well, that's all good and well, but if I don't have the right mineral piece and or physics, it might be a much slower road to Rome. Now, not saying that each one by itself isn't a good thing, but I think if we look at land and the value of it, and then we're trying to farm it and get the best out of it, we want it to flourish kind of as quickly as we can to get there, and we want to work with nature in our way to get there. And likewise, on the mineral front, if we just did, say, for example, lime, and we didn't really think about fungi, and we were still really heavy on our N applications, likewise, it will revert in a few years' time. So anytime that we think about trying to knock a paddock into shape, or we've damaged it because we had cows in there through calving and it was wet, the more closer that we can think about these three things and how we're going to tackle them, the better the outcome is going to be for us to flourish and make that recovery time short. So the big two that we're going to touch on today is really biology and the mineral piece. You know, for a couple of different reasons. The physics one to me is relatively, it's a whole subject matter in itself, don't get me wrong, but I think the value for us today is going to be in these two camps between biology and mineral. What does it mean? What are our options and how do we play that out? And we're going to go into a few details. So the physics part is really, I guess, in our minds, we think about cultivation or deep ripping, all of those things that we can physically kind of alter that structure. We're going to talk about these other two subject matters because I think in our everyday use, they're probably going to have a greater weight and bearing on where we want to go. So the biology piece is really significant. Kind of alluded to it in that diagram. If we don't have oxygen to breathe, then we do not have the right microbes we want. It'll turn what we call anaerobic. And so one of the big pieces when we're growing pasture, and I believe our audience, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, is mostly in a pasture-based system, either for dairy or might be a little bit around beef and other pieces.
That's correct, yeah.
So thanks, Leslie. Just quickly on that note, I can't see the questions and answers while I'm on the presenting mode, so we might hold them and I'll come back to that at the end and we'll speak to that. So with green pasture and with pasture-based systems, it's really easy. Like we're really good at applying nitrogen and understanding that's part of our basis in our budget, our economics. But to feed fungi takes really, really special attention. And essentially, it's easy that by nature, a green plant will almost default to a bacteria-based system, particularly in dairy where we've got a faster round length. Let's call it 30 days as a midpoint. Well, that round length means that we're coming back in a relatively short time, trying to break down brown materials for fungi food. We're generally green all the time until it dries out maybe, or it's just too wet. So kind of the two pieces I really want to speak to is fungi is a massive piece around structure, and we're going to chat into that topic a little bit down the track. Earthworms are massive. They really create a lot of cavity space for air and create porosity. And then inoculation's a really important piece of this. So we need a spectrum of microbes. We need the food sources for them. And when we get those two things right, then essentially we're able to hold our home together. All those microbes will actually function. They've got the next piece in their chain to eat and consume. We don't have what we call a food web breakdown. So we want that increased aeration. We want that increased pore space, biomass turnover. And that ultimately means that we can store more carbon and build our resilience out. So how do we build this? It's a very good question. Worms, I think, should be one of the things that we primarily focus on. A, because we can see them and you don't need a rocket scientist to come and tell you what your soil tests are. But it's a really, really good visual. And when it's right or you see them in good health, it makes your heart sing. Like you can tell that the land is really productive. You can see worm castings all along the floor of your roots or your grass roots in your systems. And it should have this beautiful tight crummy structure. So this chap in the photo here, this is Tony Reynolds, a Kiwi farmer, and this land came out of pine trees 10 years ago, and it has this beautiful crumb structure. So for me, this it tells a story of hope, because 10 years back, we didn't have topsoil. It was just bedrock material, and in Canterbury, where this particular farm was, it was just shingle, like old riverbed. And so what we see in his hands, he's made, essentially. The pasture has developed over, call it 10 years, this beautiful structure. And so in this example, when we have really, really good air, you can actually press your fingers into the soil. And that sounds really odd and obscure, but if you can't push your fingers into the soil, it's a really good sign that you don't have enough air space. And so literally, put your hand into the soil and pull out soil like this, and for it to have that beautiful crumb structure, it's a really, really good visual. I'd love to tell you that our whole farm looks like that. That's bull nannies, it doesn't. But what it does show us that it is possible, and I think that's the piece that we really kind of want to highlight here. So when we start talking about biology and how do we stimulate it, how do we build it, there's a few things that I'm going to kind of touch on here. Some of them is a little bit more in kind of a general farming sense, and then the secondary piece of that is more around what we can use through foliar, what we can use through the tow and fern. So diversity in species is a really, really big one. If I've just got ryegrass and clover, I've got two root architectures that are basically got a set design. They kind of feed specific microbe groups themselves. But the more species that I have, the more what we call phytonutrients are built in the plant. We have an amazing lecturer here in New Zealand at Lincoln University called Pablo Gulgrini, and he looks deep into the subject matter around the animal's health increases per 1 kilogram of dry matter versus a 1 kilogram of dry matter. I'm seeing a higher output in growth, live weight gained, and in milk. And to me, that's quite exciting, because let's say we're landlocked and we have an 80-hectare farm. Most of us are trying to understand how do we get the best out of it. And so his point really is, you might still grow 1 kilogram for 1 kilogram, but if we're looking at how the animal actually takes on that grass, builds out milk and puts into production, that's really important. And for me, I think there's a really big piece here. One of the hard reasons around how we've become quite compact in soil in New Zealand is we've really only got ryegrass and white clover. And we find that we have weeds like dock, dandelion start to kick in because we don't have enough deep rooted tap roots. And then those weeds that have those deep tap roots are really wanting to kind of complete that job cycle for us. And that's not as easy to graze. So it's a big subject matter in itself. Grazing management is another big key. So if we're consistently always decking it down, and then we're getting, really low residual, the conventional world around us will tell us that that gives us the most lush regrowth. That's what puts milk in the vat when we come around to graze. But essentially what we're starting to find is that that's not what nutrient density is. And yes, there's a factor of ME that comes into that equation. But if I start tackling what the cost is at the soil perspective, we can also burn out organic matter right quickly as well, because that phase of that plant having an abundance of what it needs to grow and keep pummeling sugar into the soil in a recovery phase, we're kind of just hanging in there all the time. And there's been some great work done by some other people around the world that looks at, if you graze more than 50% of the plant, that literally is 17 days recovery before you even get to a point where the soil starts to kick into gear, which is quite significant. So I think for us, the grazing management piece is not so much to tell people how to function, but round length really, really matters. And when we get it right, we sit in a space where we kind of ride the wave and we take the surplus when it lands. If we don't get it right and we keep pushing hard, call it an 18 or a 20-day round, and the farm can't grow that or keep up with that, we get on it, we find that it's really hard to recover. It's really hard to push our way forward. And, naturally, when we get really, really wet and the weather's not playing ball, we end up in that scenario where, the cows trample it in, they don't eat it all. And unfortunately, what that means is we generally struggle to push our round out to recover properly, and it's really easy to dig ourselves into a hole. So those two things are really big, but they're more of a far broader conversation. If we weren't changing those pieces, what other options do you have in your hand really comes down to the next suite of things. So things like compost tea, so that's kind of taking a spectrum of microbes and basically either fermenting them down or extracting them out of a compost into a water solution, and then you're basically re-inoculating that against the soil. Seaweed extracts is a little bit similar, so depending on what the culture is, we use some stuff here that is dry, and it's really about creating microbe food. Others here use it, and it's got a whole suite of microbes in it. There's many different ways to tackle that. Fish hydrolysates are really good. I'm kind of aware that that's a relatively new-ish space in Ireland. We have a couple of companies here in New Zealand that have been doing that for a long time, and it's probably a little bit easier to access. Things like humic and fulvic acid are really cool in their componentry, but also really cool in what they give back. And we can purchase them from kind of around the world, which is quite cool. And this last piece here, I want to touch on actually one of the most amazing people that I know in this kind of space. His name is Dan Kettridge, and he is an absolute beast. He talks about market gardeners going to an area of their garden, and they will literally collect the layers off or leaves from those plants that are doing really, really well, and then put it in a water solution and call it extract it, and then apply that to the rest of the garden. Now, the context here is to build a fat layer on a plant, you have to have all the predecessors. So you have to have enough carbohydrate, you have to have enough carbon, you have to have enough protein. Then that protein's got to move to what we call phytonutrients as the last component, but in the in-between layer, it's fats. And so if you don't have those building blocks in order, you will not produce fat. A cow can't put fat on her back unless she's sufficing her daily requirement of what she needs. And then that's extra condition. And plants are a little bit similar. So that shine, that sheen, that glossy layer that they can build is really, really important. And in that kind of market garden game, people literally take the plants that produce those things and then push that on crops that they don't have as a way to build out both biology and to offer the different minerals that that plant has to do that, which I think is pretty cool. So here's 3 bits of data around in-use efficiency. The one to the left is a UK company called Sea to Soil, and there's 2 things here. I kind of dug into a little bit of their paperwork, and probably the easiest way to say it wasn't done in like a really solid trial type format. And so they talked about porosity increasing, and they had linked it to worms, but their comparison for control and the way that they set up their methodology, there were some flaws in that. But one thing I really want to kind of allude to, and I believe holds truth, is if you increase your earthworm count, no matter what the mechanism is that you choose to do that, you can't not increase porosity. Does that make sense? Because the more worms that you have, the more tunnels that they're going to make, the more homes that you have to have in order for that to function and for that to be something. So at a simple farmer level, if we're counting, call it 25 worms in a spade by a spade, that's a really, really good outcome. But if our start point was less than 5 or less than 10, moving in the trajectory that we're building worm numbers is a really, really good start. So we've seen this quite a bit where Sea to Soil is a fish hydrolysate, and you're basically trying to stimulate the microbes to get moving. It comes really powerful when the plant's not being able to keep up with that microbe demand, and or you're trying to push production in spaces where the weather isn't playing ball, it's quite tight on turnaround, and you need to really kind of keep moving. The second one here, the graph at the very, very top comes from a company called Waikato. And the piece that I really want to kind of elaborate on here is they had a product called Fish Boost, which is a byproduct from a fish, and they have stabilized it to make a hydrolysate. But when they add Fish Boost at 10 litres per hectare, they were basically able to sustain an 11 cents per kilogram of dry matter cost structure. And back then, this is, I think, maybe 2020 data, 40 kilograms of urea was around that 11 cents per kilogram of dry matter. So I think that's quite fascinating, and it's really good to put cents and dollars at the end of, cool, a treatment might produce an extra ability to produce extra dry matter, but what is the cost of that extra? That needs to be held into account. The bottom right here is a test done by Biomarinas, which is another company that uses fish hydrolysate, and essentially the control of what we're looking at. So the first graph that looks at essentially treatment, so BM 7.5 plus N18, that's nitrogen 18 units plus the Biomarinas at that 7.5 litre rate. That had the same outcome as 35 units of N standalone by itself. Now, the real fascinating part is if you look at the nitrogen use efficiency, so that's the last bit here in the corner on the right, that difference for kilograms of dry matter that they grew per kilogram of N went from literally 15 to 25, like huge in response. So one of the parts here that I think maybe Ireland does a really good job of, from what I'm starting to understand, is, we're relatively controlled in our N use. And a lot of people would say, well, if you put more N on, you're going to get a higher outcome. Like data all over the show, be it Australia, be it New Zealand, be it America, even the UK, more doesn't equal more. And sometimes it's pieces like this that kind of really help build that confidence of like, shoot, I'm sitting in a good position here. I'm doing okay. More doesn't equal more if I'm tackling the right things. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So now I'm going to touch on the second piece of this. So kind of touched on a wee bit in the biology. Now we're going to touch on the mineral perspective. So the mineral piece is really interesting. You really want to use soil data to land a chunk of your decisions, and then herbage data in combination with soil data becomes really helpful because you can kind of see, okay, my soil has X, but why am I not seeing that in the plant, and where does that lead me? This is Mulder's chart, and here we've got pictures of things that antagonize other things and things that stimulate other things, and there's a whole bunch of relationships here. Conventional ag here in New Zealand doesn't really pay attention to this. They sort of think, if I have so much calcium in soil, I'm going to be happy, and this is my rough reference range. But the truth is it really does matter. So the background bones of people that understand nutrition, you will find that as a general rule, there's quite a lot of what we call Albrecht principles that are coming through. And for me, I sit in a similar camp where I don't treat that like a Bible that we read and you run with your life. However, there's a lot in it in terms of the functionality of why and why certain things are important. And we're going to kind of touch on them today, particularly around what we call calcium and magnesium. So if we were to talk about structure in soil, there's a few roles and different minerals have different things to do and weight to bring. So I've kind of picked on here our major cations, and I've left sodium out of this conversation because I want to focus on these three. So this big orange circle is to represent calcium, and you can see a positive charge at each end of him, and that's because he's got 2 positive charge. Magnesium, we can see has 2 positive charge, but he's much smaller. And then on the right here, we've got potassium, which is a very, very small charge. Now, Graham Sate is the person that really drummed this home for me, and I think educates at a really high level on the context of this. So if you literally say calcium is the size of a basketball, okay, everyone picture a basketball, magnesium is the size of a tennis ball. Now, I don't actually know what the size of potassium is, but my gut feeling would tell me to the tune of like a pea or a marble in comparison. So if the clay structure, these negative charges of the soil, if I've got 2 positive charges, that's going to be a clay particle on each side. Calcium is a really big molecule. It's a really big unit. He holds a lot of space. And so up here on the top right, where we've got these jars with stones, I find this a really good kind of way to think about it. And that is, if I just fill the jar with rocks, I have a lot of space for air. But if I fill that jar up with sand, or AKA potassium, that's very, very small, I'm going to pack a lot into that jar, and there's not going to be a lot of airspace left. And this is why cations all bring something. There's relationships about how much of something I want or not. and that needs to be held into account. Weybrook, there's a paper that the name Nikki and Andrew Watts, we touched on it last year. Tom and Fert have a really good breakdown on it, but Nikki is an incredible human who produced a paper that a lot of us have found a lot of weight in, which is really around in response to liquids and what happens when we buffer it with humate and so forth. So in 2021 into 2022, they sold that farm that all of that work was done on, and they've brought this farm, and it's called Weybrook. It's in mid-South Canterbury. We're milking about 1,500 cows. It's about 465 hectares, kind of effective dairy, and then we've got about another, I don't know, probably call it 70, 80 hectares that we kind of winter crop on the actual dairy unit itself. So we had a lot of issues when we first turned up, and what we did was our calcium levels are very, very low. And I'm kind of quickly going to run you through the systematic approach and how we tackled this. So because we needed calcium, that was a massive shortfall. We needed potassium, we needed a large chunk of things. The goal really was to try and start the ball rolling. So we literally did 1 ton in winter, which is I'm not a big fan of, but we were so dire we needed to do something. 2 ton of lime a little bit later on in spring. We invested 97,000, and in our case, we returned 430,000. I have another graph coming up soon that will kind of touch into that. We moved from 260 units of nitrogen, so that was pre our involvement, to 130. They should have been at 190 already, but they just were in their last ticket to ride, wanted every piece of production out of that platform before they sold, and that was kind of the predicament we walked into. We did a large chunk of oversowing clovers and plantain through the Canaan Ahu, and we stitched in annual ryegrass in all of our areas that were very, very thin. It turned out that they had used annuals on about 20% of the platform because they didn't want to face the cost of actual perennials because they knew they were going to sell. One of the biggest pieces here that I really want to allude to was calcium nitrate we used in conjunction with urea. Now, Leslie and I chatted on the phone, I don't know, it was probably 6-8 weeks ago, and he was asking, what do we know of calcium nitrate, its place? And if you want to do some digging, there's a book called Nutrient Rules by Graham Sate, and he does this beautiful interview type structure where he chats to some really cool power weights, and Bruce Tanio was one of them. Bruce Tanio has now died, he's dead. But he has a massive legacy of some stuff that he's left behind him that helps a large chunk of what we call this world, which is sort of building out nutrition from a soil perspective. So he shared with Graham that he could use 3 kilograms of nitrogen in calcium nitrate form that would outcompete urea at 60 units of nitrogen. I'll say that again. Calcium nitrate at 3 kilograms of nitrogen could outcompete in maize 60 units of nitrogen. And I was like, holy dang, that's really significant. And when I first learned about this, which was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have enough balls to do 20 to 1. That's just nuts in my view. We have a client base that we try and move our way there, but we got to try and find our feet and find the worth. But essentially what we did was we basically moved to 20 kilograms of urea and 10 kilograms of calcium nitrate was a huge piece of the winning ticket to how we didn't lose production, even though we'd significantly dropped in. So what I'm saying is to reduce from 260 units of nitrogen to 130, that's half. If you don't play your cards right, that's a death sentence because the production is not going to be there to hold you. So one of the key factors was we put lime on in the background. We oversowed with clovers and plantain. Cool. The next piece of that is what is the nitrogen form that we're using, by how much and how in our system. And then this next piece that we touched on was getting traces on that make our legumes fire. If we don't start fixing nitrogen, we're not going to climb our way out of that hole. And there's serious, serious consequences to land from that. Where did that leave us? Good question. So in that year, 22, to be fair, their original production goal was like, I think it was about 700,000 milk solids over the platform. and we did 675. The prior year to us taking over, I think they did about 650. So it was still an improvement from where the farm was, but we sort of felt a little bit gutted that we didn't get to where we wanted to. But from 23 season, so August, and that's for us calving, from August 23 into March 24, we had produced another 1.5 tonne of dry matter in that window. So yes, the lime cost us, I think we spent, I think I had on the previous slide, about $97,000 in lime, but the production outcome for that was really significant. And at a $9 payout over 2 seasons, we're talking a roughly 12.5% increase. And here in New Zealand, we're getting paid $9.50 per milk solid at the moment. It's a really serious win when we start to get it right. On the right here, we can see a picture of a clover. So many of you have kind of seen pieces of this before, but we want that nodule, that rhizobium bacteria, to be really, really red. And it's quite hard to see here in this picture. We'll be able to send out a PDF at the end, but to get that right, it takes some of the trace elements and it takes air. If we don't have either one of those and the right microbe, it will not function. So it's a really easy way to go dig some holes in your paddock, go have a look at what you've got, and test out whether or not you have the right things to make it function. So the heart here is the more nitrogen we fix, the less that we have to pay bringing something in the gate for that gap. And nitrogen is a unique piece of our system where we can actually fix them from the atmosphere. Other minerals like phosphate, sulfur, trace elements, we can't. So in spaces where we can harvest something for free, I'm all about that. And I think that's really exciting. So these guys had a really serious compaction issue. We had a really big breakdown in soil, and gratefully in their scenario, bulk lime was something that we were able to tackle. From past history of what Leslie has shared with me, some around our soil test data there in Ireland, we live in this camp where we're looking into more of this scenario, which is I actually have enough calcium in my soil. I don't need more calcium, but I'm finding that I've got structural breakdown. It might be because I've got a breakdown in my microbes. It might be because I've just had literally bucket loads of rain and I'm just really tanked. I'm really struggling. So this next wee section is going to be talking about this topic of liquid calcium, and I'm going to go there first and we'll talk a little bit about it. But calcium is ripped out from things like carbonate to get to what we call pure calcium, and they attach a polysaccharide to it or sugar to stabilize it so you can actually get it out in the paddock. Now, this particular crop, I had a phone call from a farmer of mine, and we had a really rough start. We had cultivated the soil. We had some pretty wet conditions. We couldn't stow it, and then it kind of actually sat barren for about 4 weeks before we could actually drill it. And in that time, the soil had really settled, and we just had that much rain that it was tough going. So this middle picture, if you can kind of imagine that, like I have dug it down the side of the face of the maize and then I pushed it over. The roots just kind of went like down a fraction and they're mostly horizontal. They didn't want to go down any further. We were just tight, really blocky, and it just didn't want to go anywhere. And on the right-hand side, I've used what we call sap analysis, which is measuring kind of like the bloodstream of the plant to kind of figure out what is where. And we can see here that like calcium is the third one down. We're sitting in kind of like an okay space. I'm relatively comfortable with that. But when I looked at the soil structure, we were just absolutely tanked. Like we were really in that scenario where we had an 8-cylinder motor, but we're really sending fuel to 4 cylinders and we weren't going to get the full benefit out of it. So this is that same crop after application, and to be fair, we did pull our nitrogen application forward to kind of help our way out of it. But my point here is we did liquid calcium at 10 litres per hectare, and it was enough to flocculate that soil. And to flocculate means that you kind of pull soil particles in, and then it creates that air structure around it. And that middle photograph is not like pretty, it's not what I would call beautiful structure. However, vastly improved from the start point to the fact that we managed to finish the crop of maize and get done and be there. And I can't remember where we landed in terms of total yield. I think it was around about that 22 tonne. For us, it's about average. for our expectations. However, had we not done that treatment, we would have really felt the wrath, I think. And so we use it as a way to play catch up when the conditions weren't right. And the cost structure of that was about $60 a hectare for treated. So if we said that we would have lost out, I reckon we probably would have lost about 3 tonne a hectare quite easily if we had not done that. That's the kind of difference that we're talking there when you start working back on kilograms of dry matter. Right, Canaan, all good and well, but what happens in a pasture type context? So this is another farmer. This is Ewell Dairies. You can look them up on Facebook if you want. Really, really impressive farmers. Yet we do have some of these pieces of our farm that have just got breakdowns, and we're struggling our way along a little bit. So here on the left, we can see it's quite compact. It's quite thatchy. I'm kind of holding this between my index finger and my thumb, and it's kind of just ripped up, quite flat, and had like a blocky type nature underneath it. And we didn't have a lot of topsoil in this setting, probably about, no, actually probably not quite, probably about 150 mil of topsoil, and then we did go to shingle. So that's not kind of rough country for where we are here. Now, in context here, what we're looking at is, okay, we've seen this calcium flow through on this person's maize. What does this do for us in a pasture scenario? So the background context to this picture is this is an effluent bot. We've got really high potassium levels. We are a closed gate system, and we're really high on inputs, around about 1.2, maybe 1.3 tonne of supplement per cow. And it's just coming into the farm all the time. So our historic effluent patch sits in base saturation values of like 6 to 8%, which would be beautiful for growing grapes, except we're not. We're trying to grow grass. But because it's really high in potassium, we have that really small structure pulling to those soil clay colloids, and it makes the soil very, very tight. Now, according to our soil test, we actually didn't need more calcium here. So this is why I say it resembles Ireland, is because in some of the soil tests that I've read, we have surplus of calcium, like too much in some areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got good structure. And there's a bit of a breakdown there in the link. And so what we did here was we used control. So that's just adding basically 60 mil, sorry, not 60 mil, it's about adding 2 inches of, what have we done this? 75 mil. Adding 3 inches of water to these tubes. Now, these were some of the first ones that we've done. We've done some since these with kind of uniform cylinders that go into the soil. At the end of the day, what we've done here is we've drawn up to a 75 mil mark from the bottom and then measured down. So it doesn't really matter how big the cylinder is because the volume has changed in reference to the face size, just to kind of bring that back into alignment. So when we treated with control, so that's putting in 75 mil of water and having a runtime of 45 minutes, control basically read out that we've got 60 mil left. At 5 litres a hectare of liquid calcium, add that to 200 litres of water, we were left with 62 mil. And quite fascinating, the minute we moved to 10 litres a hectare of what we call liquid calcium, we only had 21 mil left. But this is over 45 minutes. So what we're saying here is that when you add the liquid calcium and you have enough water to flush it through the soil, it literally opens up the soil. If you had a pentrometer, you could basically test this in 2 weeks' time and see that it has moved you forward, which is really, really fascinating. This next piece, hopefully this will load, is a video. As you can kind of see, a bit of a yellow tint to it. Actually, a difference over here. Practically that side by side, very similar stage. Right? Some pictures out there. Look at this. Tucker. Clover's quite erect. We're up. There's not enough soft ground to foot. Probably a little bit thanks to the rain and a little bit of irrigation, but pretty plump day. The hydro cows. Quite surprising, quite pleasant when you look at that sort of difference between us and a phone. That's pretty remarkable. Right. So we did this in about, this would have been March last year, so 2023. And it's probably quite hard to see the color and difference here. What I'm trying to show you with that video is that on one side of the fence, these paddocks were basically grazed within 1 day of each other. So in English, close enough to a same time frame in terms of recovery. But the untreated, when you stood your gumboot in the field, the grass wouldn't fold over your toes. It was quite open in that context, and it had the same recovery as treated. Now, the reason why that's quite fascinating is that the treated side, we had a rough guesstimate of like, we're probably sitting around 300 cover more at least. So being conservative, we call it 300 cover more. On that side of it, we would say, if we multiply that by 9 dairy rounds in a year, that's quite a serious amount of tonnage that we're missing out on. And so we got quite excited about that, to the point where this farmer literally did the whole dairy platform this spring, and we've got growth rates of over 100 kilograms for a duration of time, which we haven't had in about 10 years. So that's kind of anecdotal data, but he had enough confidence from the back end of this that we were seeing enough fruit, that essentially he was willing to pay that cost. And again, it was around that $60 to $70 a hectare mark. On the right here, we can see that the structure has picked up in that soil. Like, we've got a bit more crumb nature to it, and this is still relatively short. Like, this is only about probably 20 days after application. So very, very short in time, which is quite fascinating. So what are we doing here? What are we talking about? So this is a calcium molecule. If you were to try and attach it to, say, like calcium carbonate, like lime, essentially these red pieces here, we're breaking the bond between the calcium itself and then the carbon piece, and oxygen pieces, which isn't very easy to do. And it's a relatively new concept, I guess, in the greater world.
Okay,
So you're breaking
let's
those.
jump in there. We've just had a
Yep.
question on the video. The quality wasn't too good on the sound. The question was, what was the treatment difference between those two paddocks?
Good question. So both, literally, we were following the dairy cows with probably about 40 kilograms of conventional, so just granulated urea on that context. The difference was the side with treated was 10 litres a hectare of what we call hydrocal, so that was the branded name of product, but call it liquid calcium, versus control or no treatment, was the difference. And that cost structure for them at that time, so this is about a year ago, was $60 a hectare. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So conditions where we have a really great difficulty in getting calcium to function really, really well is basically when we have these list of things. So soils that don't have a huge amount of microbe functionality, soils that are low in plant exudate. So this is the piece where I was saying around grazing round and management. Like, if that plant isn't superseding what that soil needs, we struggle to make it fire and keep those microbes in a really healthy state. You can measure this through low bricks, and then carbon to nitrogen ratio. We want to kind of achieve a certain level. And in particular, like Australia, we have what we call high salts or sodium soils, where this is what's the best way to put this? It really breaks down that microbial community being able to actually function to its greatest ability. The reason why this works so well is due to its size. With fine type lime, you might be dealing with sort of 60 to 80 mesh, maybe even 100. The breakdown time on that is quite quick. Versus if you're dealing with something like ag lime, which might be, say, 30 mesh, it takes 24, 36 months to kind of fully break its way down. And so if you're getting calcium by itself and being able to inoculate it, the turnaround time frame can be quite quick. These two, so this person on the left is called Alan Pearcey. He's an ex-vet here in mid-Canterbury. He's actually a powerhouse of knowledge. He's so passionate and super scientific and gets so fired up that it's actually really hard to follow. And if you think I speak fast, you'd have to really hold on to your seat. Gordon Rajendram, he is a person that's come out of, I believe, ag research here in New Zealand, and sort of an independent soil consultant. So This is a trial. This is another liquid calcium product we have here in the New Zealand market. And I guess the efficacy of what I'm trying to communicate here is what happens when we treat versus untreat, and where does that leave us in total. And so the graph on the right, you kind of see the two highest bars are the treated farms, and we're basically talking about total grass growth or kilograms of dry matter per hectare. This was a 100-day test run. So from January 24 to May, and this data is on the growth hub for Fert. So I'll show up a bit of a link at the end that you can follow and you can go find this information. But in 100 days, they grew an extra 1 tonne of dry matter harvested over control, which is quite serious. You know, if we say that we've got 200 days, you know, in New Zealand, we have a 300-day milking season. What does that mean when you extentuate it over 12 months? And that data will be coming through to us here sometime in that January, February timepiece. So something to kind of watch for in that space. The return in terms of investment versus what you're seeing back out of it, this treatment costs 16 cents per kilogram of dry matter. Just to kind of give you a bit of a ballpark, what am I spending to kind of get that? Bananas. Look at that, we've got about 5 minutes to go. We're hanging in there. So, slight divergent topic. We kind of really wanted to touch on this because I think it's a very topical piece to the Irish at the moment. And we feel for you guys. It's quite heartbreaking when you feel like the government is fighting you and you're doing your best you can to get the best outcome for your farm, for your land, and for the country. And then you feel like you've got people kind of beating you over the head in an unhelpful manner. So we feel for you guys. Keep battling away. It'll all come through in the end. These are 3 papers that I referenced that talk about nitrogen either use efficiency or what we say nitrogen response. The top trials, this is Quinn et al. 2006, basically looked at granular urea versus a fluidized when you add a treatment with MBPT or agrotane. So in many of this work, we had like granular, and then you had what we call fluidized. So that's not quite Fert. It's a grounded product machine, and then it's applied through spinners. But the context is it sort of does have uptake through the foliar mechanism. And that paper basically gets to this conclusion, which is treated N had a higher response than just urea by itself, which is quite fascinating. Dewar et al. 2011, so that's the kind of orangey graph down here on the bottom. They looked at urea in granular form, urea in what we call fine particle form, and then urea in fine particle form that had been treated with agrotane. Now this kind of blows my mind. Like, I guess in English, if I think about a coated N and I put it in the Fert tank, in my mind, some of that coating is going to wear off that material as it breaks down into the water, yet it's still going to be present in the water. And ironically, this paper would say that there's still weight, there's still a positive net impact by having it versus not having it. And Leslie rang me and he was like, Canaan, what's the deal? And to be honest with you, I don't deal with a lot of treated stuff myself because I would rather buffer it to carbon, so stabilize it with carbon rather than creating some sort of coated MBPT or agrotane or urease enzyme inhibiting component, because I think it's a safer, longer road to Rome, yet has a greater efficacy where we're not killing things. Yet ironically, when you kind of look for literature to support the argument that it has a really bad negative impact, it's either been removed from the market space or it's very, very thin. And I haven't yet worked out whether it's just to do with control of our fertilizer world here in New Zealand where that information has been kind of suppressed, or if there's something a little bit deeper to that, or maybe that there's actually some merit here that we've kind of not ignored, but we've just held to the side for now. And the last one here, this is a little bit harder to kind of see, but there was a lot of different treatments in this paper. So, sorry, this is the Zaman Summit Quinfos 2009 paper. So we kind of have a whole bunch of different treatments here. So we've got control, urea at 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, 30 kilograms of nitrogen plus irrigation, and then sustained green, which back then it's kind of the it's the treated product for us, and it traded under a different name back then. And then it moves into FPA, so that's the fluidized particle application, and then goes to those different treatments. And essentially what we see here is the extra kilograms of dry matter grown versus the kilograms of N was significant with treated versus by itself. It had a greater net benefit to be had. And that part is quite encouraging. It's not all doom and gloom for us. I think there's going to be ways that we can still improve where we are and find our way, find our fit. I guess for me personally, the only negative would be that you've got to pay a higher premium for it, which is a little bit sad. But in theory, it shouldn't mean that it has to compromise us growth. And I think we want to leave on that note where it's not all doom and gloom. We're going to be able to find a way to make it work in our setting and our fit. Thank you. Appreciate the time. For more information, you've got Leslie's contact details here at Future Ag. The Growth Hub is a relatively new piece to the Fert's website. It's not on their front page. You have to kind of go to the right where it's got resources, go down to the Growth Hub. But there you will find the AgriForum information, and that's going to be a space where a lot more data is going to be fed in terms of like minerals and their functionality, just a whole bunch of resources that I think are already there, plus are coming to that market space. If you want to find out a little bit more about us, you can find us out at www.agronomics. Thank you.
Thank you, Canaan. Thank you very much for that. I have a couple of questions for you. On the calcium nitrate, is there much of it used as a foliar in New Zealand?
It's a relatively new piece. If you go to like the horticulture places that grow like lettuces, tomatoes, all of that kind of produce, they're huge, like massive users of calcium nitrate. And in the broad hectare market, so call it pasture and crops like what we're playing with here, it's low because the dollar value of what the sales we're making from liquid nitrogen is far higher than what we make in something like calcium nitrate. And because you can use significantly less, essentially we're finding that we're only just starting to play around with that here in our Kiwi market on the broad hectare. But I think it's going to be a growing space because we're trying to get the best outcome that we can, trying to really reduce our negative impact with having too much. And where's the fit? How do we find that?
And the fact that the nitrate is bonded, I suppose, or bound to the calcium, does that mean that it's less prone to leaching?
Correct. So we had a big problem here in New Zealand where industry forced us, like we used to apply nitrogen in the month of May, sometimes touching into June. For us, that's winter, right? June, July is our dry months. And then we carve down in August. But people that have come off a really high N use, we've gone to a window now where we're not allowed to apply for, from May. So May, June, July, and then August, we're waiting for soil temperature. So we're going without for 4 months. And we've done quite a bit of work in our camp on the agronomy front of what can we do to stimulate it to keep holding and moving through wintertime. And one of the greatest uptakes that we've seen is calcium nitrate in that space where it doesn't leach. The plant can ask for it when it wants to break that enzyme apart, but because of its size and its weighting in that game, it doesn't leach is awesome because it just sits there. And if you haven't got the organic matter function or soil temperatures low, you're not sort of nervous that you're going to leach it out the bottom end, which is very exciting.
Okay.
We have a question to the calcium product, Canaan, like the guys that have Fert, what should they look for with regard to picking a calcium product? Like if the liquid cal product's not available there, is just ground lime the equivalent in water, or is there something particular they should look for?
Very different. Ground lime will start you on the road out, but it's a different mechanism where the carbonate's been disjoint from the calcium molecule itself. And the power of calcium is quite powerful. So it has the ability to draw things and pull together, and it's very strong. And so essentially it doesn't want to stay stable by itself. And the market, they won't tell you this, so just kind of hold this information, but they will generally add sugar to it because it's a very cheap form of carbon that can stabilize that calcium until you get it out in the paddock. Then the sugar comes off and then it binds the things that you want it to flocculate, create that structure. So it's very different. How easy to access it, I'm uncertain of. And some slight caveats around that is I actually tried the Agriforum product about 10 years ago, and we tried it on a dairy unit, and we had an incredible result. It was a huge dairy unit. We're talking about 500 hectares, and everywhere it made a big difference. I was really blown away. I was like, how can, literally, in their scenario with the product they were using, it was 200 grams per hectare, have the same knockout power as like 2 ton of lime. I was gobsmacked. But then we tried it on another farm and the result didn't come. And I've some recent experiences where the result didn't come. And the number one conclusion that I'm landing is if there is not enough water to wash it in, it'll just sit. So you need the moisture levels to get that calcium through the soil. And if you don't, you're not going to see that result. Now, will that result come through in the end? I think so, because the calcium stays there. But if you sort of lack moisture and you don't have enough to really drip it in like 20, 30 mil, you're going to struggle. And I think that's something that really caught me by the short and the curly. So I'm definitely of the space where you test it. You know, if you've got a new product to market there and you're trying to find your fit, test it in an area or over a paddock that you know you've pugged, it's really badly damaged. I'm not really willing to go back regrass yet. It's a really good space to be like, cool, I'm going to try something different here and see what merit it is before you go and blow it out over a big area. In that pasture space where we did that test, we were about a 430 hectare platform there, and we did 100 hectares as control, as treated versus control, which was the rest of the farm. And like it launched, but we were like, if that pulled off in 100 hectares, like there's really no reason why it shouldn't pull off on the remainder. But that was his test. Like, yeah, I was like, can we find a smaller test? But yeah, farmers, eh?
And is there have you much experience using gypsum to help flocculate soils?
Yes. Not masses of experience here because we don't generally struggle with that same issue, but you can, because the sulfate sulfur will help leach out the excesses, and then that calcium piece will kind of help keep you there. How much you need is a very interesting thing, and I couldn't guide you on that. We have a couple of dairy units here that have a lot of dairy waste onto them. And essentially where they've landed so far is that if they don't put 2 ton a hectare of gypsum on per hectare, so this is just straight granular, they're not dairying there at all. Like cows will get sent off because it's that toxic, it's that sick that the cows can't stay and function. That essentially, that's their mechanism or one of the ways that they've been able to control that. So gypsum is a really powerful tool. It has some boundaries to it, and within cost structure, I think it is a mechanism. My gut feeling is you're going to be spending a lot more than $60 or $70 a hectare. So just kind of need to do the maths, test through the methodology, like at what rate did I see the best impact for me, and economics. You've got to try and land those few things.
Okay. The last question I have is on that trial where you were looking at water infiltration rates. So what was the time difference between when the products were applied and when you applied the water, or were they applied together?
With those circle cylinders?
Yes.
The same. So literally filled up each cylinder, so 75 mils to replicate 3 inches of rain on top of each one, and done like everyone ran on the same timer. So it was run for 45 minutes, and then the mils left was what was left after that 45-minute period of time had finished.
So was the liquid calcium added in with the water? So like, yes. So literally you're talking, it increased the water infiltration rate within 45 minutes of application.
Yes. It's bananas, like.
That's nuts.
Yeah. So it had 3 different mixes. So one that had 5 litres per hectare at a 200 litre hectare water rate, and then a 10 litre hectare at a 200 litre hectare water rate, and then 0, so just 200 litres a hectare per water. And And then that was the result. And the difference between that paddock on the right and the paddock on the left, when I showed that picture after the video, we were literally looking at I'm going to be conservative. I think it was about 300 kilograms in cover difference in less than 30 days. So if we say in a dairy round, 300 kilograms of growth difference, and you multiply that over, say, 9 or 10 dairy rounds in a year, you're talking serious tonnage that we've left at the plate, or that we can gain from that if we get it right. And I think that was the encouraging part for us, where we knew that we had found a solution in a space where, like, the nature of it is we're dairying, like, we've got big animals on 4 hooves that just a very small surface area touching that soil. It's hard to keep the soil open with that compaction and with that traffic. That's just, it is what it is. Unless you really want to go down the regen pathway where, like, you're trampling that much that protects the soil. In kind of a hybrid between conventional dairy and where we are, we're trying to kind of play in this limbo zone where we want the best of both, but we're only prepared to kind of give up so many things. And that's kind of why this has been, to me, one of the places that we can go to is, without changing your grass species, without changing your round length, what other options do you have to play around with? And it moves into these spaces where you're trying to feed biology, use some things that can kind of help flocculate the soil and keep it open in spaces that we don't have as much control in.
Okay. I just want to clarify one point on the protected urea. Is we have had lots of people over the years, and this year have tried protected urea in foliars, and the machine is well able to melt it down, etc. There's no problem there, but it's the responses. We haven't been getting the growth responses with it, and a possible difference between why that's happening here, or to explain why that's happening here, and the difference between Ireland and New Zealand is, I think, I don't know what the rates of Agritane or MBPT are applied in New Zealand, but in Ireland it's 600 parts per million. I think it's about 400 or 414 in New Zealand. The Irish, I suppose, bureaucrats, government decided, advisors, consultants, state decided that they would apply a higher rate of Agritane or MBPT onto urea fertilizer here to be sure. And I don't know if that's a factor in why we are not seeing the growth responses here that those trials have showed in New Zealand previously.
Interesting. Question to you on that. Is that the only thing that's going in your tank, or are you adding in things like fulvic acid and other things like hydrolyzate and microbes as well? And you're still finding?
I suppose it would be our main 3 ingredients, Canaan, would be the urea, sulfur, and that's generally coming from sulfate of ammonia, and carbon, which would be predominantly coming from humates. So generally it would just be a switch. Instead of using unprotected urea, we're switching to protected urea, and a dramatic fall off in growth rates. You could actually say no response in a lot of cases. So I don't know, is it due to the fact that we are using that higher rate of MBPT or protective agent on the urea, or what? I'm not sure, but the responses are quite different in Ireland compared to that trial.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So there could be weight there in bearing. One piece of my mind that I would go to that I think could be helpful to look at is what happens if you increase the rate of humate. This comes from a context of people that use citric acid, fulvic acid, combined with glyphosate. What has been proved to have merit right now is, even though they have glyphosate applied, if they've added a high rate of fulvic acid, the ability for a microbe to break down the chemical residue is significant. And what that means is what's left as a residual, either in the crop or in the soil, is significantly less. So in my mind, it's the same context where you're using the benefit of things like fulvic acid to stimulate the microbe to actually break the MBPT down faster. And that should be plausible, but you you'd have to test that through at how much do I need to do that. Potassium humate, I think, was a form of humate that you guys have been using in the past. Not all humates are equal, but that one in particular, I would look at trying to increase the dose rate to offset it a wee bit. There might not be in the sweet spot yet, but that'd be worth exploring because there might be some really easy wins there if that holds merit.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping at this stage that we are going to succeed. We're pretty positive that we'll succeed and we'll be able to hold access to unprotected urea. So I don't think we'll need to go down that protected urea road.
Cool.
Fingers crossed.
Awesome.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. Hope for the Irish.
Yes, absolutely.
Andrew Rees asked one more question around what are the parameters to look for in liquid calcium products? Also, is it possible to make them on farm? It's quite a unique thing where I don't think the technology exists to make it on farm. It would be something you have to buy at this point in time. That said, would there be means to do that in the future if you knew how to? I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I'm still at that phase where we're testing that through in heaps of different scenarios to test weight and make sure it holds the truth that we're hoping it to. And outside of that water piece, we're seeing merit to that so far. But I think it's quite a high-tech involved process. It's not easy to do, otherwise everyone would be doing it. And ironically, when I brought it up with Leslie, the company that basically sells it through AgriForum here in New Zealand is based in South Africa, I think, or somewhere overseas. It might even be the States, but it's not in New Zealand itself. So it doesn't even get manufactured in New Zealand. We have to bring it in. And my gut feeling would be similar for Ireland. Like, not everyone's got the technology to actually produce it, make it.
Yeah, well, again, just to clarify, we are running a trial at the moment with a trials farm in County Tipperary, where we've had a number of treatments. We have 2 of those ionic calcium products, and we also have a liquid gypsum or a soluble gypsum. And so far, now it's early days yet, but so far the liquid gypsum is actually performing better.
Awesome.
Than everything else. And still, we're looking at a 33% improvement in water infiltration rates, but it's early days. So we're looking at what are we in? He sent me the results yesterday. I think we were in about 6 weeks last week. So we had 6 weeks of testing done. We're going to keep it going right through the spring. So we are testing those products out. It is a reasonably good soil, pretty good, kind of a clay loam. It's not a heavy clay. So there is quite a good clay content in it. But we're trying those products out to see are they worth looking at for the marketplace and have they something to add, because they are not. One of the products is quite expensive. It's ridiculously expensive. It's €50 an acre. The other is a lot more reasonable. But so far, the liquid gypsum, which is a UK product, is performing much better. Yeah,
fantastic. And that's
that product can be bought. Yeah, sorry, that product can be bought in the UK direct from the manufacturer. I think I put a link up to it in the UK WhatsApp group there during the summer. So that one is probably worth looking at, even to try some small acreage yourselves and just see can you see improvements.
Totally. And I think that's the heart, right? Like, when you can't change the weather, we have to kind of farm our way to it. To get pummeled with that much rain over a season or over a spring, they're critical months where you're trying to produce, and it's super hard to bounce back from. So I think the merit's going to show up. It's just keeping exploring in the right options, find the fit for you and your farm.
Yeah.
Cool.
Has anybody else got any questions or queries? If you're feel free to mute your or unmute your mics if you like, or put a query in the chat, in the question and answer chat section.
Including questions, if anyone's got questions around the machine or the Mix app as well, feel free to bring them up today.
Actually, Tim, while you're there, are you getting much queries from clients in Australia and New Zealand on gypsum?
Not so much in New Zealand, but certainly in Australia, we've got a lot of people using it where they have high salinity soils. I don't know too much more about it from a chemical point of view, science point of view, but certainly they are putting it through the machine. It's often more readily available than fine lime in Australia as well.
Okay.
If you do use it just from a machine point of view, it reacts more even. It's harder to handle than lime. It's very different, even though it looks like it in a fine point of view, from a fine ground point of view, but in water, it's quite hydrophobic. So when it's in the machine, it does like to float with it if you don't have, enough agitation. So use it with caution for the first time. For example, if you're putting a ton of lime in your 2800, start with maybe half a ton of gypsum.
Okay.
Point of view.
Okay.
Leslie, can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Ned.
On just you mentioned say it earlier. I'm sorry, I missed nearly an hour of your thing that go away. Say it mentioned using burnt lime with boron at 10 kilos per hectare, I think, in an apple orchard. Any comments on the basis that burnt lime was a more concentrated form of calcium?
Yes, well, I suppose it depends what you're looking for, Ned. Did he put that on as a foliar or did he put that on as a soil drench?
He mentioned in one of his there's videos he's put up at the moment. Some of his clients did this in the orchard.
Yeah.
No, any more than that, and it was putting it. I think that the question was how many hectares. He knows it would burn to ground if he brought too much, so he ended up with 10 kilos of burnt lime, 1 kilo of boron, and he put in some that sort of stuff as well. And it was a farmer did that, and then he went on saying that he had lost his micronized lime in his selling that, but like burnt lime is very thick and small. I presume this is as micronized as we want, like,
Yeah, the problem with burnt lime into tone fert is you don't want to put burnt lime into tone fert. It reacts violently with water, as I have found out in the past. So yes, it's extremely fine. It's extremely available. There is a granulated burnt lime product on the market, Ned. I'm trying to think of the name of it now, but it won't come to me. And it has to be stored very, very carefully. It has to be handled very carefully. It's extremely reactive with water and generates heat very quickly. But it is very available. It raises the pH very quickly. It's probably, of all the lime sources, it's the one that will raise the pH the quickest. But it's also quite aggressive. So in terms of soil biology, etc., it wouldn't be my first one to go to. But if there was a mechanism to apply it in the granulated form, and you needed a quick fix on soil pH, or a bit of quick calcium availability, that might be an option. But it would be in a dry form rather than mixing it with tone fert.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay.
Thank you, Ned.
Teresa's got a question here just around some products that she's currently using. So per hectare, she's using 100 kilos of lime, 400 litres of water, 2 kilos of humic, and 150 millilitres of boron. And the question is just, I'm not sure what the best rates to go with. Are these okay? Also using a little bit of milk and compost extract.
Nice. 100 kilos of fine lime, 400 litres of water, 2 kilograms of humic acid. Yep, that's cool. So the boron piece is really around getting the true impact of the calcium. He is the controller, if it were, for the sugar to get out of the chloroplast down to that root structure. But he's also a little bit like the steering wheel. And if you're short of boron, you need a lot more calcium to do the same job role. So rather than spend that money inefficiently, mating it with the boron like you are is really, really wise. We normally aim for about 200 grams a hectare of what we call DOT boron, disodium octaborate. And my gut feeling is your 150 mil of boron would be 10% dilution factor, which might be maybe 15 grams. So you might need a little bit more boron than that. The true way to test that would be to apply it, take your herbage test and find out where your boron levels were. And we're finding here in New Zealand amongst our team, so we're about 7,500, 8,000 hectares in dairy, and we're finding that the boron marker of what we want is about 15, north of 15 ppm. So that's milligrams per litre, or ppm. To get there takes quite a bit of control, and we either have to use the format that you're talking about here, which is a liquid version that we keep up with the time Fert. And sometimes we actually use it in a hybrid model where we use a granulated format of what we call hydroborosite, or boron that's tied to calcium, magnesium, and sodium. And that then gives us a greater chance to release from the soil. And then we're basically tackling the foliar and those snippets that we miss it in low rates like you're using. So granted, you're seeing that ppm in your plant, I think you're going to be fine, but you'd really want to test it. I don't know the boron product that you're using, but that would be your test, is what's coming through the plant after treatment. Is it enough? Is it not? And then just make your adjustment from there. Your 20 litres of milk and 20 litres of compost extract. Mint, there's a lady called Nicole Masters. She used milk quite a bit to reduce what we call moly toxicity. I don't know the functionality of how that works, but she's done it multiple times, and that's always blown me away. But milk has a lot of what we call lactobacillus in it, which is really awesome. And there's a spectrum of microbes in milk if it's raw milk out of the vat. So there's really good merit in doing that. I kind of like to think about it as like when we're putting on minerals, if I'm adding biology or microbe foods to it, then it's a double win and I'm going to see the best overall outcome. There's a little research around that goes into that subject matter, and it's really because it's hard to say that I only moved one parameter. So like with my calcium product, I only put on this much and I added biology, and then where did I land? Because biology is never singular. There's always a whole suite of microbes. You can't control it down to one family member, like very, very rarely. And we live in the real world where on my hand, there's literally more than 1,000 types of bacteria. So it's super hard in the science world, but I think that there's merit there. And so depending on what you're using it for and the structure of what you're trying to tackle, I think it's a really, really good starting point, and then kind of test out on your plant, how's that coming back? Am I seeing the result that I want to? Would really be the true essence of what am I seeing for that result, for that investment.
Okay, is anybody else any more queries, guys?
Can I ask another question, Liz?
Sure, Ned, fire away.
No, as I said, I missed about an hour of the presentation because of something happened. But you were as I was finishing up, you mentioned a book by Sayet, kind of an interview type book. What was the name of that book?
It was called Nutrition Rules by Graham Sate.
Yeah,
Nutrition Rules.
And you recommend it as I want to have.
I think so. Sounds like I know a lot about science, but to be honest with you, I feel like I'm a very simple creature. I like to try and read something that I understand. And at the beginning, when I started using pictures, that's one of the major reasons why I use pictures, is because if you just throw a whole bunch of words over me, I literally will go over my head, or I find a struggle to actually connect it on my tree framework where it fits. But that book, it's interview type style. So Graham will ask a question and then they'll kind of give an answer. And I think there's some absolute gems, like Bruce Tanio talking about why he uses calcium nitrate and at this level. That was the first space and place that I have heard that information. And I was saying to Leslie, like, I haven't tested that through at 20-1, but I have done a lot at 3-1, and we're just moving to 5-1 now. So let's say you're dropping from 50 kilograms of urea, you're hoping that 10 kilograms of calcium nitrate is going to kick ass the same. We're getting to that point now where we're finding that to hold truth. And so I don't know how to get out to that 20-1 yet. I don't have the customer yet that's comfortable to go there, but I think it shows, there's these snippets of gems that I'll call them forefathers, or people that have run this race well and truly before our time frame, and that gets lost if that information is not passed on. And I think places of literature like this book are really quite cool. And there's a whole host of people in this book. Elaine Ingham's one of them, Gary Zimmer. There's some people that are really rich with compost from Germany, and they just share their pieces on their context, like how they've learned that this holds merit, or how they've learned to cultivate a paddock without using glyphosate use and so forth. Like, there's just a lot of rich content in there, but it's very digestible. Like, you can kind of read a page and then just sit on it, and I love that. I think that's, to me, where it's quite inspiring, is people that have had years and years of experience of trialing something or testing something through in their context, and then they're just sharing it. You kind of pick up these gems and you're like, okay, I need some reading about that topic, or I need to find out a bit more. But very encouraging from my perspective.
I have a copy of that book, guys, on my laptop, so I will see if I can load that on to the WhatsApp groups there later on. It's I think it's 2016 I saved that copy, so it's been around a while. I've done a few courses with Graham State over in the early days. That was back in 2016. But yeah, Bruce Tainio's interviews on that book. So yeah, I'll put that in the WhatsApp groups later.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have another question there from. Oh, Tim, is it up? Good man, Tim.
Yeah, looks like there's a free link there as well online if you can't find it.
Yeah, nice.
There's a question there from Andrew. Can you pair up the ionic calcium with fish hydrolysis and traces in a tank mix?
Yes. So depending on the form, Agroforum, they keep their calcium in a powder, and it's in a sealed bag, and they want you on hand on farm to take the calcium and add the sugar to it. And that process has to be done first, because the calcium will then bind onto that sugar, and that's what keeps it stable as you add your fish, add your traces to that. If you did that in the other way, where you add, say, fish or add traces first, I don't know the outcome, but my guesses are you'll probably run into some compatibility issues, because it will want to bind to the wrong thing and settle. And the liquid calcium product, I don't know about the ones that Leslie's been playing with, but the ones that we have, that we use here in our crew, they're already in liquid, and they've been bound to calcium. So calcium's been bound to either sugar or carbon already. And that's what then makes it safer for me as the farmer to use, is because I don't have to worry about that first interaction. That's stable, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Yeah, if anybody wants to click on the chat, Tim has been good enough there to put a link up to that book by Graham State. So you're about to click on it and download it straight there to your phone or your website.
Nice.
And also the link is up there to the Agroforum website, which is a really good website. Has a lot of really interesting information on the impacts of soil compaction, etc., and on production. And so yeah, it's a good website to keep track of.
Totally. Cool.
Les, it just so happens I'm still outside. Can you put those two links onto WhatsApp at some stage?
I will, yeah.
Right, well, thank you very much from our point of view, Canaan and Leslie, for pulling all this together, and all the customers there. So yeah, certainly reach out if there's any further questions from, if I can be of help, or Canaan. But yeah, really appreciate you all joining, and thanks again, Canaan.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Lizzie. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for joining in tonight. Much appreciated. Thanks, Tim.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, all.
Bye.